Hello and welcome to Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service, with me, Emily Finch. Today I'm taking you back to 1968, to some of the most violent and widespread protests Japan has ever seen. A series of student protests took place at 152 universities throughout the country, starting at Nihon University in Tokyo, and later the elite University of Tokyo, where the majority of the country's prime ministers are educated.
This year, graduation at the prestigious University of Tokyo was not quite like other years. Disgruntled medical students, demonstrating outside the assembly hall, refused to allow the graduation ceremony to take place. They were protesting on behalf of a classmate dismissed for kidnapping a teacher in an earlier protest against the faculty.
I've been speaking to Kazuki Kumamoto, who was a first-year engineering student at the University of Tokyo in 1968. He took part in the protests, which led to a violent 2-day siege of the university's main hall by hundreds of students.
The
protests at Tokyo University started at the medical school when a group of students were dismissed from their course. Their dismissal from the university was considered unjust by all the remaining students in that department. At first, it was just the students at the medical school who were protesting, but the riot police were brought in. When these riot police entered the campus, students throughout the university were furious and started protesting.
During the late 1950s and 60s, Japan had been going through rapid economic growth and had successfully hosted the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. The electronics, shipbuilding and engineering industries were booming, and the widespread poverty that immediately followed Japan's surrender to the Allied powers in the Second World War had ended. Hundreds of new universities were built around Japan during this time to educate the expanding workforce, but the quality of teaching and the facilities were often poor, leaving students frustrated.
Most of the 500 universities are private profit-making concerns, eager to take on as many students as possible, and they skimp on facilities. This is a library that sells study space at 10 shillings a session. For that, you get the tea and the newspapers thrown in.
Protests first began at Nihon University, Japan's largest private university, in April 1968, when students found out that 2 billion yen, or the equivalent to $57 million today, was missing from the university's accounts. Thousands of students barricaded themselves into their classrooms for 6 months and organised their own lessons, where they debated political theory and what they should do next. They also clashed with riot police, who tried to periodically take back control of the university. Meanwhile, Kazuki and some of his fellow students at the University of Tokyo were taking similar action.
There were a total of 50 students in my class, and around 10 to 20 of us gathered for the debate. We debated each other mostly as equals. But when we first started, we had a few older students take part. They had graduated a year before, or were repeating a year. Some of those older students were members of the youth leagues of the Japanese Communist Party, and were initially very vocal during the debates. They wouldn't let us join in at first. After these daily debates, we write up our conclusions on posters, and we would display these outside the classrooms.
Did you see any violence at these protests?
We didn't consider the clashes as violent, but there were some students carrying pipes and wearing helmets. These people were usually members of the Communist Party or members of an opposing group called the New Left. Many different protest groups emerged at this time. We call them sects, and there would often be fights between these groups. There was a lot of infighting going on. I wasn't a member of any of these sects. I was just a normal student joining in the protests.
What did your parents think about you joining in?
At that time, my parents were in Kobe, near Osaka, so I didn't have to see them every day. And they couldn't question what I was up to. But before the war, which was a time of great oppression, my father had also been involved in a series of student protests, which took place at Tokyo University. So we shared that personal experience, so I think he understood what I was doing.
A large number of the non-political protesters were part of the Zenkyoto, or the All-Campus Joint Struggle Committee, student-led bodies that spread to universities across the country.
A police car is burned. 100 students are arrested. 40 people, including innocent passers-by, need hospital treatment.
Tokyo University Zenkyoto initially demanded the return of the medical students who had been dismissed from their course, but they became more radical in their demands as the protests moved into 1969. Around 400 members of Tokyo University Zenkyoto eventually barricaded themselves into their university's main administrative building, Yasuda Hall.
What stayed with me the most is my memory of what happened at Yasuda Kodo between the 18th and 19th of January 1969. The riot police and members of Zenkyoto fought a fierce battle there. It was just like a terrible war. I was just outside the gates of the campus, and what I saw has stayed with me. There were riot police firing tear gas, and some of it covered me.
The students fought against 8,500 riot police officers, throwing Molotov cocktails and other handmade missiles off the roof of the building's clock tower.
There was fighting going on between the different sects, and I saw that some people were injured because of this.
200 police officers and 30 students were injured over the 2 days of fighting. The police were eventually able to break through the barricades and arrest the protesters, bringing the siege to an end.
I don't remember the protest movement suddenly ending. Our teachers returned, and our lectures resumed. But we still regularly held our debates instead of taking part in these lectures. But when exam season came, we were told we wouldn't be sitting an exam. We'd all have to submit final reports instead. Otherwise, we'd have to repeat the year. We had no choice but to submit our reports, and we returned to our regular lectures. I was no longer willing to take part in these student protests, and I started attending my lectures again.
Taking part in the protests influenced Kazuki Kumamoto to support grassroots causes throughout his working life.
I stopped protesting in one way, but the questions the protests raised saw me question why I was studying and for what reason I was continuing my research. Being involved in the student protests made me re-evaluate my choices. I decided I wanted to research issues to do with pollution and the environment. And I worked at the university for 31 years. I retired 2 years ago, but I've continued my research. And I still support grassroots causes.
How would you say the protests changed Japan?
Before the student protests, there had been other protests which mostly involved members of left-wing or right-wing parties in Japan. Protests were mostly about political parties or Japan's post-war relationship with the United States. The student protests saw individuals spontaneously join in out of their own choice and take part in open debates for the first time. That style of protesting has stuck and has influenced other social movements in Japan, including those for environmental justice or for human rights.
Kazuki Kumamoto was speaking to me, Emily Finch, for the Witness History podcast. It was a whistle-down production for BBC World Service.